This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Neatsahone, and it's time for another MTG Top 10. In this series, I usually rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition, but today we're going to do something different. I'm going to talk about 10 mechanics that I think were failures. In this video, the failed mechanics we're going to look at aren't going to be ones that are failures because they're too good. I did a video on that back in 2019 if you're interested in hearing about mechanics like Storm, Affinity, and Dredge, which are failures for exactly that reason. Instead, this video is about mechanics that are failures for other reasons. Some of them are here because all or most of the cards with it are unplayable, and others are here because these mechanics are miserable to play with, and for some of them, both are true. One thing all of these mechanics do have in common is that they don't appear on very many cards, because Wizards of the Coast realized that these mechanics were failures, so with one tiny exception, we've never seen any of these mechanics return. Alright, without further ado, let's dive in with my picks for the most failed mechanics in Magic history. At number 10, I have Tribute, which appears on 11 cards in Born of the Gods. If a creature has Tribute, it makes your opponent make a choice to pay the tribute when it enters the battlefield. Tribute is always accompanied by a numerical value, and paying the tribute involves putting that many plus and +1 counters on the creature. Each of these creatures then has an ability that says if tribute wasn't paid, and they come with a bonus. For example, your opponent has the choice of making Faragax Giant a 5-mana 5/5, or making it a 5-mana 3/3 that does 5 to them. I will say that the flavor of these cards can be pretty cool, the idea being that if your opponent doesn't pay the tribute, the creature punishes them in some way, but the mechanic's biggest problem is simply that it lets your opponent make those choices, and in fact, any sort of card that lets your opponent make some kind of choice between effects could be here at number 10. Most cards that do that kind of stink, but Tribute is the most egregious example of this because it ended up falling so flat despite being a big mechanic in a set. So what's wrong with giving your opponent a choice like this? Well, your opponent will always choose the least impactful option. If they're holding removal anyway, they'll just pay the tribute. If the other effect doesn't really matter to them, like they have a high life total when you play Faragax Giant, they're just going to take 5 and not really care about your 3/3. Some of these cards have even less of a decision to make. For example, against something like Siren of the Fanged Coast, your opponent is just always going to give you an air elemental instead of letting you steal their creature. It's very difficult to put your opponent in a legitimate pick your poison scenario with these and other effects like them, so you often end up not really getting your mana's worth when you play these cards. Overall, Tribute has proven to be a very weak and uninteresting mechanic that barely had an impact on Magic's 60-card formats or Commander. At number 9, I've got Rampage. It was originally introduced in Legends, and it was last used in Mirage. If a creature with Rampage is blocked by more than one creature, it gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is equal to the Rampage value, so Horrible Hordes here becomes a 3/3 if it gets double blocked. The problem that you have here is the thing that Rampage punishes is irrelevant in like 99% of Magic games. Double blocks and beyond simply aren't that common of occurrences, especially outside of Limited, so most of the time, Rampage doesn't really do anything to make your opponent play the game any differently. Especially because the way they costed these creatures with Rampage was like they thought it was going to be an amazing ability, but most creatures with it can just be single blocked by the larger creatures your opponents are likely to have by the time you cast your overcosted Rampage creature. Your 6-mana 4/4 Frost Giant and 9-mana 5/5 Flying Tika's Dragon aren't going to concern your opponent at all, since they'll be paying the same amount of mana to get way better creatures. People always like to talk about using a lure effect on Rampage creatures to make them huge, and that can be pretty funny, but it's still not good. You have to take a pretty huge risk to make it happen, and your opponent still needs the right board state for Rampage to actually trigger. At number 8, I've got Amplify, a mechanic from Legions. Onslaught Block was all about creature types, and Amplify was a mechanic that fits in this category. When a creature with Amplify enters the battlefield, you can reveal cards in your hand that share a creature type with that creature, and then that creature gets a plus and +1 counter for each creature you revealed. For example, Aven Warhawk has Amplify 1, so it gets a plus and +1 counter for each bird and or soldier you reveal. This is a mechanic that I think actually looks fine on paper, but once you play with it, you'll realize the huge problems it has. Namely, that if you don't draw your Amplify creature in the right order, they end up being terrible cards. I mean, how many birds and soldiers do you need to have for Aven Warhawk not to be terrible? At least 2, right? And you had to jump through some serious hoops to get there, while also giving your opponent some free information. And if you get your Warhawk after you've played your creatures, well, then it's really terrible. And this type of design is true about Amplify across the board. They really overcosted the creatures with the ability without taking into account how horrible the fail cases are. Maybe, if they designed the Amplify creatures the way they designed Kilnmouth Dragon, the only Amplify card anyone cares about, the mechanic would have fared better. It has Amplify 3, and an ability that lets it tap to do damage equal to the number of counters on it. So in the case of the dragon, you really need to only have one dragon in your hand for it to be good. This is the sort of design they should have applied to the others too. In short, they really overcosted the cards with Amplify that aren't named Kilnmouth Dragon. It's like they didn't take into account how frequent the fail case would be with these cards. At number 7, I've got Clash, a mechanic that made its debut in Lorwyn block. If a card clashes, that means you and your opponent reveal the top card of your library, and then you can both put that card on the top or bottom of your library. A player wins a clash if the card had a higher mana value. In other words, it kinda lets you and your opponent scry 1. But what card is revealed does matter. Like with Adderstaff Boggart, if you win the clash, it's a 3-2. If you lose, it's a 2-1. The problem here is that this is just a super roundabout way to have flip a coin on a card. I know it isn't identical to coin flipping, since if you have a deck with higher average mana values, you're likely to win more clashes, and if you can manipulate your library or your opponents, you can push things even further in your favor. However, even if you do all of that, you're still going to lose your fair share of clashes, and warping your deck so you are more likely to win clashes isn't worth it. Basically, this is flip a coin, but it takes way more time since both players want to keep track of the information they get from Clash, and then they also both have to decide whether they put the card on the top or bottom of their library. Furthermore, because of its symmetry, your opponent is getting a pretty big advantage every time you clash, and they're not paying any mana for it. That's a very bad design, and it doesn't help that they didn't get especially creative with Clash. For example, they slapped it on one of the absolute worst creatures of all time, Bog Hoodlums, a card that's terrible whether you win the clash or not. It's almost worse that Clash was on a few cards that were playable in competitive Magic, like Broken Ambitions, because dealing with clashes at a competitive tournament is a real nuisance, and the word nuisance does a pretty good job of summing up this mechanic in general. I think they've done a better job using this sort of mechanic with Explore, which isn't symmetrical, but still gives you an outcome depending on what the top card of your library is, while giving you access to card selection. It doesn't interrupt the flow of the game nearly as much, and the effect doesn't feel like a wash because your opponent doesn't get anything out of it. I will say that they did just release a new card with Clash in Karlov Manor, Marvo Deep Operative, and he's actually got kind of a cool design, but it still doesn't fix all the problems I have with the mechanic. It does mean, unlike the other mechanics on this list which haven't returned in a very long time, that Clash has actually been used recently. At number 6, I've got Radiance. Ravnica sets are famous for introducing cool mechanics to represent each of the guilds, and Radiance is the Boros mechanic from our very first trip to the plane. But not all the guild mechanics can be winners, and in fact, this mechanic is awful to play with. So here's how it works. All cards with Radiance have a targeted effect, and Radiance makes it so that targeted effect affects not only the creature that you target, but each other creature that shares a color with it. For example, Cleansing Beam will do 2 damage to target creature, and each other creature that shares a color with it. The first time you read this, it might not seem that bad. If your opponent has a bunch of small creatures who are the same color, well, you get to do 2 to all of them. But the problem with Radiance is that it's symmetrical. That's right. If the thing you want to target with Cleansing Beam is the same color as any of your creatures, well, you're going to do 2 damage to them too. Cards with Radiance are all over the place in what they do. You have removal like Cleansing Beam, but you also have Bathe in Light, which does the Radiance thing with protection from a color, so in that case you can end up accidentally benefiting your opponent's creatures. Obviously, you are the one who chooses how to cast these cards, so you can avoid shooting yourself in the foot to some extent, but the problem is that it makes all of these cards very narrow, because the main way to avoid shooting yourself in the foot is just not casting these when they aren't advantageous, and that's going to be the case in a whole lot of situations. On top of all of those gameplay problems, Radiance is also a really strange choice for red-white, which tends to be the most aggressive color pair in the game. They could have gone in so many different directions where they didn't print a bunch of near-useless cards. Luckily, they've done a good job with Boros mechanics in our return visits to the plane, and that helps make up for this disaster. These problems aren't limited to Constructed either. These cards were miserable in Ravnica Limited too. Speaking of mechanics that were miserable in Limited, At number 5, I've got Ripple from Cold Snap. When you cast a card with Ripple, like Surging Sentinels, you reveal the top 4 cards of your library, and you can cast any revealed cards with the same name as that spell without paying their mana costs. Then you put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Cold Snap is a really weird set, since it's supposed to be the third set for Ice Age block, a block that was released in 1995 to 1996, but Cold Snap was released in 2006. The block model at the time meant you released 3 sets in a row that shared mechanical and story themes. The first set in a block was huge, and the next 2 sets were very small by today's standards. Usually, if you were playing limited, you would get 1 pack from each set once a block was fully released. But you couldn't do that with Cold Snap because the other sets in Ice Age block were long gone, so you drafted 3 packs of Cold Snap, and you did this despite the fact that the set only has 155 cards. This meant you got a ton of duplicates, so instead of finding a way to avoid the problems duplicates created, Wizards of the Coast just decided to lean into it with Ripple. This was a horrible idea. If you follow my limited content, you probably know that I think Cold Snap is the worst limited format of all time, and these cards are a big part of that. Many limited games just came down to who could cast their Ripple cards first, since they often ended up getting 2+ free cards out of their library. Drafts were also thoroughly uninteresting for the same reason. Just grab all the Surging Sentinels you can and nothing else matters. Ripple also doesn't play well in 60-card formats, mostly because the cards with it are too underpowered to matter, and you're way less likely to ripple into your additional copies in a 60-card deck that has a 4 of restriction. The one kind of funny thing about Ripple is that they gave us Thrumming Stone, which can be fun in commander decks that run cards that let you play any number of them in your deck, like Relentless Rats, since you can end up casting as many rats as you want in most cases, but that doesn't change the fact that this mechanic is really poorly designed. At number 4, I've got Rhystic cards. These are all from Prophecy. The card you probably know from the 9 Rhystic cards in the set is Rhystic Study, one of the most heavily played cards in all of Commander, and also one of the most obnoxious cards in all of Commander. All the cards with Rhystic in the name let your opponents choose to pay mana to make it so a card doesn't do something, or does a weaker version of something. The idea is kind of cool, and Masks Block in general was the first time they really designed cards with multiplayer games in mind, but the way they implemented this is nightmarish. So you have Rhystic Study, a card which forces your opponents to make a decision every single time they draw a card, and of course people tend to do that at least once a turn. This is awful to play with or against because you have to deal with this trigger so many times. So Rhystic Study is good and obnoxious to play against in Commander. The other cards with Rhystic are just awful. Rhystic Cave is a land that taps add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, unless of course one of your opponents pays 1 generic, in which case it does nothing. Rhystic Siphon is a 5 mana sorcery that drains 5 life, unless someone has 3 mana up, in which case it does nothing. Rhystic Tutor lets you grab any card from your deck and put it into your hand, unless of course someone has 2 mana up, in which case it does nothing. If you've ever wanted to hand your opponent colorless counterspells that don't even make them use up a card, this is the mechanic you're looking for. This makes Rhystic kind of a funny case on this list, since there's one card that has had a huge impact on Magic's most popular format, so we're all familiar with a card with Rhystic that is really good and frustrating to play against, and yet all the other cards with Rhystic are unplayable. That's a pretty serious design failure. At number 3, it's Sweep, a Betrayers of Kamigawa mechanic. Every card with Sweep is an instant or sorcery, and they all have you return lands you control to your hand for some type of effect. For example, Barrel Down Sokenzen wants you to return mountains, and it does damage to a creature equal to twice the number of mountains you return. There are so many problems here. First, returning lands to your hand is giving your opponent some very serious tempo, so you need these cards to do something pretty powerful, and none of them do. Especially because they all do absolutely nothing if you choose to return no lands. If you only return 1 land with any of them, they end up being really bad cards, and returning more than that is also a really bad idea. Even though the effect you get is going to be bigger, you're going to go far enough behind on mana that you're still doing something that's really bad for you. On top of that, they're all specific about the land type you have to return, so you kind of have to play them in monocolored decks. I think they knew this mechanic was bad too, since it only ended up on 4 cards in the set, an abnormally low number of cards for a new mechanic, especially one that shows up at lower rarities, and there isn't even a complete cycle. There are randomly 2 white cards, 1 black card, and 1 red card with Sweep. These cards basically say you lose the game if you make the mistake of playing them in any format. At number 2, I've got Dexterity cards. There are only 2 of these with black borders, Chaos Orb and Falling Star. A Dexterity card is one that requires you to physically do something with the actual physical piece of cardboard. In the case of Chaos Orb and Falling Star, you're supposed to flip them over the game board, and what they come into contact with determines the effect. Chaos Orb destroys every permanent it touches, and Falling Star does 3 damage to any creature it comes into contact with. These effects seem insane to us today, and that's a pretty good indication of how bad an idea these cards were. One of the biggest problems is that there was no clear rule about what the other player could do while you were flipping the card. Could players move their stuff out of the way? The funniest story about Chaos Orb is that a player ripped theirs apart and flipped it over the board to destroy all of their opponent's permanents. This has been immortalized in the silver-bordered card Chaos Confetti. The other problem is that, this is a card game, and requiring people to practice flipping a card over the board to maximize how effective it is just a really bad idea. It's also not the best in terms of promoting accessibility. Believe it or not, at Magic's very first World Championship in 1994, 3 of the top 4 decks ran Chaos Orb, so there was actually a major Magic tournament where people were using these kinds of cards. The Orb got fully banned in 1995 alongside Falling Star, and since then they haven't printed any more Dexterity cards. Before we get to number 1, I do have 3 honorable, or I guess dishonorable, mentions to discuss. First, there's Banding, which made its debut in Alpha. In terms of actual gameplay, I think Banding is fine, and that's why it didn't make the list for me. The mechanics on this list are all failures, even if you do understand them, but that's not true with Banding. The problem with Banding is that it's way too complicated to easily explain to people, and that's why it often gets lumped into lists like this. Let's read the Banding reminder text together. Any creature with banding, and up to 1 without, can attack in a band. Bands are blocked as a group. If any creatures with banding you control are blocking or being blocked by a creature, you divide that creature's combat damage, not its controller, among any of the creatures it's being blocked by or is blocking. So in other words, if you attack or block with banded creatures, you get to decide how your opponent's creatures divide combat damage. That's relatively straightforward, but making it work within the game's rules is kind of a nightmare, and that's why the reminder text is made up of 3 sentences and 60 words. So the mechanic is a problem for sure, that's why it's been retired since 1997, but I don't quite think it's a full-blown failure. Next, there's Cumulative Upkeep, which made its debut in Ice Age. Of these 3 honorable mentions, this is the one that was the closest to making the list for me. Cumulative Upkeep is a mechanic that requires you to pay a cost every upkeep. So on Juju Bubble, for example, you pay 1 generic that first upkeep after you control it, but then you put an age counter on it, and the next turn you have to pay that upkeep cost for each age counter on it too, so the cost keeps going up. In other words, this mechanic is downside, and they definitely put it on lots of cards where the downside is way too massive, and it's also just a feel-bad mechanic in general since it asks so much of you. However, they did design some Cumulative Upkeep cards correctly. That is to say, they made the cards powerful enough and efficient enough that giving them a downside made sense, like with Mystic Remora and Mine Harness. In fact, there have been enough successful Cumulative Upkeep cards over the years that I've done a top 10 on the subject. They've also come up with more interesting ways to use it over the years, like with Jotun Grunt, whose upkeep cost is good at hating on graveyards. So in the end, Cumulative Upkeep didn't make it for me. The last honorable mention is Epic. This is a mechanic from Saviors of Kamigawa that appears on a cycle of rares. Once you cast a card with Epic, you can never ever cast another spell, but you get a copy of that Epic spell every upkeep. There are some problems here. Making it so one player doesn't do anything the rest of the game, other than resolve 1 spell a turn, is very uninteresting, and 4 of the 5 of these are incredibly underpowered for coming with such a big downside, but Enduring Ideal isn't. It saw competitive play, and I think it's actually a cool card. It searches up an enchantment every turn and sticks it directly into play. Yeah, this mechanic's not super well designed, but for me, the one really cool card in the cycle of 5 was enough for it to avoid making the list. Alright, let's take a look at the mechanic that I think was the biggest failure in the history of the game, which is Ante. Ante was part of Magic's original design, but it's clear that even then they weren't too sure about it. This is because playing with Ante was optional. Playing with Ante meant that at the beginning of a game, you and your opponent would put the top card of your library into a pot, and whoever won the game won those cards. That's right, full-on gambling. This wasn't a great thing to include in the game, as it was a turnoff for lots of consumers and would have made lots of parents wary about letting their kids play the game. It also meant that they might have to acknowledge playing Magic was gambling, so tournament venues and the like would have to follow certain laws. If they just had this ante as some random optional game mode that happened to be in the rulebook, that would be one thing, but they printed actual cards to support this game mode, like Jeweled Bird, which lets you exchange it with your card in the ante. The problems with Ante don't end there, though. There are all kinds of logistical issues, too. Like, if you used Ante and someone's deck now had too few cards in it, what are they supposed to do? Especially at a tournament. That would lead to people's decks actually changing throughout an event. This is why, in the very first ban and restricted announcement ever, Ante cards and Charizard were the only cards that got entirely banned. They were building up to the World Championship that year, and they didn't want to deal with the headache that Ante would have caused. This is why we haven't seen a card printed with Ante since 1995, although the fact that they were still printing a card with it a full year after all the others had been banned is pretty funny. So, those are my picks for the most failed mechanics in the history of Magic. Do you think I left any out? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past videos, including more that look at failures in Magic design, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.